Hi, my name is Sean Burns and I'm the CEO of Outlier. And today I'd like to talk about how numbers lie. Specifically, how even when we have the right data in front of us, the right metrics that are accurate and correct, we can still make bad decisions. And we often do that because we read things into the data that aren't there. We interpret it incorrectly. And I call that interpretation bias. So let's talk about that and figure out ways that we can avoid it. So let's say this is our data about our business. This is our revenue over time. And we're tasked with answering the question, are we growing? Which seems like an obvious question, but this data is very noisy. It's moving all over the place. There's no clear trend. And like any real world data, it isn't telling us anything obvious. And so our job is to interpret it. So let's do what I'm sure you would do first. Let's add a trend line, a straight line trend line to start with. And clearly now that tells us a story that it is growing. Actually, it's growing pretty well. It's pretty rapid and things are up and to the right. But let's be honest, it's really hard to believe that data is actually a straight line. It's dipping in the middle and it's kind of flattening out towards the right. So a straight line is maybe not the right way to look at it. Let's try to look at it using an exponential trend line, a second degree polynomial. That looks a lot better. It dips in the middle when the data dips and it's kind of rising to the right. And the great news is not only does it tell us the story that we're growing, it says we're actually growing faster and faster as time goes on, which is great news for us to report back to the rest of the business. But again, it's really hard to believe that the data really is growing exponentially, that it will continue to accelerate as time goes on. It's just looking at the data, it's hard to interpret it that way. Let's try a fourth degree polynomial, so more curves in our trend line. And this looks more accurate. It dips in the middle again. It kind of flattened out toward the right. And this does seem to fit the data, but now there's no clear answer. Are we growing? Maybe. It looks like we were growing for a while, but we stopped growing. And so the more accurate we got in our interpretation, the hazier our result got. And so often you can imagine people will tend to try to interpret the data in the way that drives the conclusion that's more obvious than this. But the farther we get away from what the data is actually telling us, which in this case is frankly not very much, the data is very noisy, we start to make decisions based on data, but not based on what the data is actually telling us, but based on an interpretation of the data which is incorrect. So how do we avoid interpretation bias? Because obviously it's a very dangerous thing to have around. The first is we can actually make sure we're forming conclusions from the data, not bringing our conclusions and looking for data to back them up. That's the difference between asking the question, what is our revenue and is it growing, versus how fast are we growing? If you ask the question, how fast are we growing, you're assuming there's growth. You'll look for growth in the data wherever it might be. But if you ask, what is our revenue and is it growing, you're kind of asking the data first and then looking for growth, and there may be no growth. You may be shrinking, you may be contracting, and so the data will influence your answer. You're not starting with a conclusion trying to back it up. Second, seek out independent analysis. Make sure the people that are looking at the data have no vested interest in a specific answer. If my compensation is based on revenue growth, I'm going to look for revenue growth. I'm going to see revenue growth in that data, even if it may not be there, because obviously as a human being, I want to maximize my compensation. It's a natural bias that you would have. Whereas if I'm looking at the data and I have no specific vested interest, I have no incentive to read the data one way or another, I'm much more likely to be objective. And finally, if you do see a pattern or a trend, use multiple different data sources to triangulate it. With a single data source, you can often read almost any pattern into it if you wanted to, but it's much harder to see that same pattern across multiple different data sources. So in that way, it gets much more difficult for you to use this interpretation bias as the data is more varied across data sources. I hope you found this useful. We here at Outlier are in the business of helping you make better decisions using data.